Hey guys, tonight we slip into the smoke-choked alleys and soot-stained rooftops of Victorian Britain, where the world smells like coal, horse manure, and bread that's gone slightly stale but is still sold anyway. The lanterns flicker, the gutters run with things you'd rather not identify, and every rumbling stomach belongs to someone trying to stretch pennies into meals. You're about to wander through this world, and spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this diet longer than a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to see how far and wide you all are tuning in. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk down a crowded Victorian street. The air tastes of soot. It coats your tongue as if you've accidentally licked a chimney sweep's brush. Shops are crammed shoulder to shoulder, bakers, butchers, grocers. Most display food behind glass, but the quality of what you see doesn't match the hearty pictures in modern cookbooks. That meat? Half gristle and possibly already 2 days too warm. The bread? Dense, chalky, stretched with mysterious powders. Welcome to the hungry city. The first thing you notice is just how many people are around you. Industrial Britain is booming. Cities like London, Manchester, and Birmingham are packed tighter than a tin of sardines. Ironically, sardines being one of the few foods that sometimes actually arrive in tins. Population growth has outpaced sanitation, and while people come to the city chasing work, they also bring their empty stomachs. Historians point out that between 1800 and 1900, London's population alone skyrocketed from under 1 million to over 6 million. That means 6 million mouths to feed every single day, often with supply systems that creak and stumble. And here's the mainstream fact of the night. The Victorians had no refrigeration. Ice boxes existed, yes, but they were more for the middle and upper classes, and ice had to be imported from places as far as Norway or even New England. So, when you're staring at that cut of meat in the shop window, you have to hope it was slaughtered this morning. Tomorrow it's not only unappetizing, it could kill you. Now, one quirky little tidbit. Bread was so central to daily survival that bakers sometimes extended their loaves with fun additives like alum, chalk, or even powdered bones. Imagine toasting a slice of that with a nice cup of tea. Crunchy, right? And yes, people did sometimes crunch down on what felt like sand in their bread. It wasn't artisanal, it was survival. Still, food had to come from somewhere. Trains helped, hauling in produce and meat from the countryside, but they also drove up demand since city dwellers suddenly had access to foods they hadn't seen before. Oranges from Spain, bananas from the Caribbean, even coffee beans by the sack. It sounds glamorous until you realize most of this was beyond the reach of working families. A dock worker might see crates of bananas unloaded, but he might never taste one himself. You keep walking and spot street vendors. Pies, oysters, roasted potatoes. Food's cheap enough to grab on the go. But there's always the question, how safe are they? Oysters especially. These were harvested from the Thames and other waters so polluted that they'd make modern health inspectors weep. And yet oysters were cheap, filling, and everywhere. Poor families ate them almost daily, while today they're a delicacy that costs you a week's rent. Funny how that flips, isn't it? Historians still argue whether Victorian diets in big cities were truly disastrous or just different. Some say people were chronically undernourished, living on bread, weak tea, and hope. Others argue that for many, especially once wages rose a bit later in the century, the diet included more meat, potatoes, and dairy than we might think. It really depended on where you stood on the social ladder. The social ladder, by the way, is obvious even in food smells. If you pass the narrow homes of wealthier merchants, you might catch the aroma of roasted beef, buttered vegetables, and puddings rich with suet. Meanwhile, turn the corner to a row of workmen's tenements, and you're more likely to inhale boiled cabbage, overcooked to the point of mush. Same city, different plates. Let's not forget the little luxuries that kept people going. Tea was the great equalizer. Whether rich or poor, nearly everyone drank it. For some, it was proper afternoon tea with porcelain cups and scones. For others, it was a chipped mug filled with leaves brewed so many times they tasted like bitter rainwater. Still, hot liquid in a cold climate is better than nothing, and you definitely need it after trudging through the damp, smoky streets in thin boots. You hear a hawker's voice. Hot pies, fresh pies. The word fresh is doing heavy lifting here. That pie might be filled with beef scraps, offal, or even questionable meat from animals that didn't quite make it to market alive. There are jokes, dark jokes, that some pies had fillings you didn't want to identify too closely. Did anyone actually eat cat pies? Historians shrug and debate, but the rumors existed for a reason. You duck into a dingy pub, partly for warmth, partly for curiosity. On the counter sits a platter of bread, cheese, and maybe some pickles. It's called a plowman's lunch, though the modern name wasn't used yet. You bite into the cheese. It's sharp, crumbly, decent. Then you wash it down with a mug of small beer, low in alcohol, high in calories, and safer than water. A man at the next table tells you he's been living off bread, beer, and onions for a week. He doesn't look thrilled, but he's alive. By the time you step back out, the lamps flicker against fog rolling in from the river. Stalls close, shop shutters slam, and the city grows hungrier as the night goes on. Food is survival, but also identity. What you eat tells people exactly where you belong. And tonight, you belong to the street, ears tuned to the hollow rumble of your own stomach. You wake up stiff and cold, curled in a corner of the city where the fog creeps under door frames and settles in your lungs. The sound of church bells tolling across rooftops means it's morning, and for some people, that means breakfast. But for you, and for thousands of others, there's nothing waiting at home. Instead, you shuffle toward the looming brick building at the edge of town, a place that promises food, but at a cost: the workhouse. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 reshaped life for Britain's poor. It meant that if you couldn't support yourself or your family, your only option was to enter a workhouse, where you'd be fed and housed in exchange for labor. Sounds generous in theory, right? Except in practice, the system was designed to be so unappealing that only the truly desperate would accept it. You weren't supposed to want the workhouse. You were supposed to view it as rock bottom. And judging by what was on the menu, that message came across loud and clear. Step through the gates and you're greeted by gray walls, long echoing halls, and the smell of something boiling. Not stew, not soup, but gruel. Gruel is basically oats or barley stretched thin with water, boiled until it forms a sad gray sludge. Think porridge, but remove most of the nutrition and any flavor. That's breakfast. If you're lucky, you get a slice of bread with it, cut from a loaf bulked out with cheap flour. The bread might fill you, but it's like eating packing material. Here's the mainstream fact. Official workhouse rations were strictly regulated. Adults typically got 3 meals a day, often consisting of bread, gruel, cheese, and the occasional meat or broth. Children might get a bit of milk or sweat pudding once a week. It was calculated to keep you alive, not comfortable. One historian put it bluntly: enough to prevent starvation, but never enough to encourage staying. And then, a quirky tidbit, some workhouses issued beer tokens instead of actual food. The idea was that a measured pint of weak ale was safer than local water. Imagine lining up not for a hot meal, but for your daily chit that could be exchanged for watered-down beer at the workhouse tap. At least it tasted better than gruel, though arguably so would drinking rain off the roof. The system was deliberately monotonous. Breakfast, gruel, lunch, bread, maybe a shred of meat, maybe soup so thin it might as well be hot water with a shadow of a bone waved over it. Supper, back to gruel or bread. The monotony was part of the punishment. Meals weren't just meager, they were intentionally bland, designed to strip life down to its barest essentials. Eating in silence was enforced, with inmates seated in long rows under the watchful eye of supervisors. No chatter, no laughter, just the sound of spoons scraping bowls. You shuffle your spoon in circles, trying to make the gruel last longer, though honestly, it feels like you're just stirring wallpaper paste. Across the table, a man gnaws at his bread, tearing at it with the kind of determination you'd expect from a dog with a bone. Children eat slowly, eyes heavy, already resigned to this flavorless ritual. Now here's where historians still argue. Was the workhouse diet deliberately cruel, or was it simply the best that local taxes could afford? Some scholars argue that officials intentionally starved inmates to discourage reliance on poor relief. Others suggest that, given the costs of feeding hundreds of people, managers were just doing what they could within tight budgets. Either way, for the people sitting at these tables, the debate is academic. You're still staring into a bowl of gray mush. Every so often, there were small variations: rice pudding, potatoes, maybe a rare Sunday portion of meat. But don't imagine roast beef and gravy. Think boiled beef hacked into chewy lumps, floating in thin broth. And that's on a good day. The portions were so small that hunger became part of daily life inside. You were technically eating, but never quite satisfied. Some inmates tried little tricks to beat the system. There are stories of men saving their bread until night and trading it with others for scraps of cheese. Children sometimes smuggled crumbs in their sleeves, nibbling under blankets later. One particularly quirky story tells of workhouse residents taming mice, feeding them breadcrumbs, and then, yes, eating the mice when meat was scarce. Tiny protein-packed snacks, though not exactly Michelin-starred. Outside the workhouse walls, the public had mixed feelings. Some pitied the poor and criticized the rations as cruel. Others shrugged and said, well, if they wanted better food, they should get jobs. The workhouse became a symbol of shame, so much so that many families did everything possible to avoid it, even if that meant living on the edge of starvation outside. You finish your breakfast, or what passes for it, and line up to march into the workrooms. Stomach half full, brain foggy, but technically fed. That's the rhythm of survival here. Gruel in, labor out, day after day. The food is enough to keep your body moving, but never enough to give you strength or hope. And maybe that was exactly the point. You step back into the streets, leaving behind the echo of gruel bowls and the cold discipline of the workhouse. The city's air hits your face again. Sharp, smoky, and busy with the smells of food that is, at least, more exciting than the gray paste you just endured. Welcome to the open-air buffet of Victorian street life, where vendors hawk their wares in sing-song voices, and you learn quickly that the city survives not on lavish dinners, but on whatever can be sold for a penny in the gutter. The streets hum with commerce. You hear a man bellowing about hot pies, 1 penny, piping hot. His cart steams, the crust golden on top, though what's beneath could be anything from beef scraps to questionable offal. You buy one and bite carefully, finding the filling salty, rich, and just barely meat. Victorians joke that cat pie and dog pie were real, though historians still argue whether those were exaggerations or whether desperate vendors really stretched their ingredients that far. Given the total absence of health inspectors early on, it's safer not to ask too many questions. Street food is everywhere, feeding those who don't have time or a kitchen to cook. Women carrying baskets of pies, men wheeling eels in tubs, children running with trays of muffins. London especially was alive with oyster stalls, potato vendors, roasted chestnuts, and eel pies. Eels were cheap, plentiful from the Thames, and incredibly versatile. Jellied eels, stewed eels, pies filled with eels. They all smelled like the river, but they filled stomachs for less than a loaf of bread. Here's your mainstream fact. Oysters were once considered poor man's food, as common as chips today. They were eaten by the bucket load in the 19th century, especially in London, where even workmen might slurp down half a dozen before heading to their shift. Fast forward to today, and oysters are a high-end luxury you might only order on a special anniversary. Time really flipped the menu. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some pie sellers, short on filling, bulked out their pies with sawdust or even mashed up potatoes dyed with gravy. Imagine biting into what you think is savory meat, only to realize you're essentially chewing a flavored wood chip. That's Victorian quality control for you. You keep walking, and the sounds never stop. Oranges and lemons, fine and cheap, cries a young boy juggling fruit. Imported citrus was flashy, but a single lemon could cost the poor more than a day's wage. So most vendors sliced them into pieces, sprinkling sugar on top, and sold them one wedge at a time. Kids crowded around for a tangy lick, mouths puckering as they sucked the juice. In a city where scurvy lurked in the background, that sour sting was more than just a treat. It was medicine in disguise. The smells mix in the air. Fried fish, cheap, bony, and oily, wafts from one corner. The origin story of fish and chips beginning in these streets. Donuts sizzle in fat, coated in sugar that sticks to your fingers. Roasted chestnuts crackle in iron pans, especially in winter, their smoky sweetness mingling with coal dust. Even baked potatoes, split and steaming, were sold from glowing ovens on wheels. The potato man stabbed your portion with a fork and handed it over wrapped in newspaper. If you wanted toppings, you sprinkled on salt, or if you were feeling daring, a dab of pickled fish brine. But here's the thing. No one's testing this food. Hygiene is a dream, not a standard. Vendors worked with bare hands, reused dirty cloths, and sometimes sold meat that was already days old. Historians still argue whether these street foods help sustain the urban poor or help spread disease. Was that cup of soup life-saving warmth? Or was it just a ticket to food poisoning? And oh yes, the soups. Coffin soup, they called one version, sold outside funeral parlors from vats that steamed all day. It was made with bones and vegetable scraps, whatever could be found cheap, and ladled into mugs for a penny. The nickname came from the seller's location, but it felt darkly appropriate. You'd sip the thin broth, grateful for heat, even if it tasted more of bones than beef. The vendors themselves had personalities as loud as their cries. Hawkers were part salesman, part showman, part survivor. Some had signature songs to announce their arrival. Others wore outlandish hats or aprons to stand out in the crowded streets. One eccentric muffin seller was said to attach bells to his tray, ringing like a one-man parade as he wandered. The competition for pennies was fierce, and flair often sold as much food as actual taste. Children played their part too, not as customers but as sellers. Some as young as 6 or 7 carried trays of hot potatoes or shrimps, shouting until their voices cracked. Imagine being small enough to fit under a bar stool, yet responsible for keeping your family fed by selling fried snacks until midnight. That was life for thousands of children in Victorian cities, their wages wrapped up in paper cones of food. And in the background, a debate lingers. Historians point out that, despite the dangers, street foods were often more nutritious than the monotonous bread and gruel diets inside workhouses. A roasted potato or a chestnut had vitamins after all, but others argue that the high risk of contamination and the lack of balance in the diet made these foods barely better than starvation rations. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. As dust settles, you notice the glow of torches around a pie cart. Steam rises, faces crowd close, and coins clink into calloused hands. You buy another pie because what choice do you have? And bite into it, hoping the filling is something recognizable this time. Warm, savory, questionable, but satisfying. That was Victorian street dining, survival wrapped in pastry, eaten on the go, with a side order of uncertainty. The night wears on, and the streets grow quieter, but not everyone is heading to bed. In the heart of industrial cities, the mills and factories never really sleep. Their chimneys pump smoke into the night sky, and their machines grind on, powered by the hands of workers who drag themselves through exhausting shifts. You follow them, slipping through the factory gates, and the first thing you notice isn't the clang of gears or the hiss of steam. It's the smell of food tucked into tin boxes, cloth bundles, and greasy paper, waiting for midnight breaks. Welcome to the suppers of the shift workers. You sit with a group of men and women huddled near a furnace, their faces lit orange by the glow. They unwrap their meals slowly, savoring the pause. The food isn't glamorous, but it's fuel for bodies that burn thousands of calories in a single shift. Bread again? Always bread, spread with dripping, the leftover fat from roasted meat saved carefully at home. One worker has a slab of cold-boiled potato, another a chunk of cheese gone slightly hard around the edges. Someone pulls out a meat pie, still fragrant though it was baked hours ago, and cuts it into quarters to share. Here's the mainstream fact. Industrial workers needed more calories than most modern athletes. A cotton spinner might burn 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day, just keeping up with the relentless pace of the machines. Yet their wages often didn't stretch to diets that matched their output. Bread, potatoes, weak tea, and occasional bits of meat had to somehow keep engines of flesh and bone running. You nibble a corner of bread, and it crumbles dry in your mouth. To wash it down, someone hands you a tin cup of broth, a weak soup made from boiling bones until the marrow surrendered just enough flavor. It's warm at least. Workers would often pool scraps to create soups or stews, stretching out meager ingredients. On Sundays, when they had a chance to cook properly, big pots of pottage simmered with whatever could be scrounged. Turnips, carrots, onions, barley. Then the leftovers got carried back to the factory in battered tins and reheated by resting them on warm machinery. That brings us to the quirky tidbit of the night. Some workers invented improvised tiffin tins long before India's daba system made them famous. They'd stack little metal containers tied together with string so that soup, bread, and maybe a pudding could all be carried in one clanking bundle. The containers sometimes got dented or singed from being left on boilers, but hey, it was a free steam oven, multitasking at its Victorian best. Food breaks were brief. You'd wolf down your supper with one eye on the overseer, then hurry back before the machines roared again. Eating wasn't leisure, it was maintenance, like oiling gears. You were keeping yourself from collapsing, not exactly dining. Still, in those stolen moments, workers bonded. Someone might trade a slice of onion pie for a swig of beer smuggled in a flask. Another might share a boiled egg, peeled carefully and salted with a pinch carried in a twist of paper. Small mercies in a world of relentless labor. Sometimes the suppers reflected cultural mixing too. Irish immigrants brought their love of potatoes and cabbage stews. Scottish workers often carried oatcakes. Jewish immigrants in London's East End unwrapped herring or black bread. Factories became miniature buffets of regional survival foods, though most still circled back to the holy trinity of bread, cheese, and tea. Speaking of tea, it deserves its own mention here. Even on night shifts, tea was the lifeline. Workers brewed it strong, poured it into tin mugs, and sipped it constantly. The caffeine kept eyes open, and the hot liquid cut through the damp chill that clung to factory floors. But don't imagine dainty cups and saucers. These were chipped mugs blackened from years of use. The leaves were brewed until bitter, sometimes reused until they looked like swamp water. Still, the ritual of tea was a comfort, and for some, it was the only warmth in the long night. Historians still argue whether industrial workers' diets were adequate to sustain their brutal workloads. Some evidence suggests that factory laborers had slightly more access to meat than rural peasants, especially later in the century as wages rose. Others point to malnutrition, stunted growth, and health records showing workers collapsing from sheer exhaustion. Was the diet fueling progress, or was it quietly grinding people down? That question still hangs in the smoke. Toward the end of the shift, fatigue sets in. People nibble on sweet treats if they can afford them. Sticky toffee, boiled sugar drops, or hunks of treacle spread on bread. A quick shot of sugar for a flagging body. One man pulls out what looks suspiciously like a candied beet, boiled in syrup to imitate fruit. Desperate times, creative measures. And yes, someone once swore they saw workers chewing on coal tar to stay awake. Not recommended, though it probably did give them a boost, along with a side of nausea. The bell finally clangs, signaling the end of the shift. Workers tuck their empty tins back into bags and shuffle into the dawn light. Their stomachs aren't exactly full, but they're steady enough to walk home, sleep a little, and come back again tonight. That's the rhythm of survival in the factory age. Eat just enough to endure, then repeat. You step away from the clang of machinery and into quieter streets, where soot-blackened bricks give way to tidy rows of terraced houses with polished knockers and curtains pulled tight. Here, the smell of dinner drifting through the air changes. Less boiled cabbage, more roasted meats. You're walking into middle-class territory now, where meals are less about survival and more about performance. The parlor windows glow warmly, and you catch glimpses of tablecloths spread across long dining tables. Families gather, their children washed and combed, their wives carefully dressed. Dinner is the main event of the day, a ritual that speaks as much about respectability as it does about appetite. A maid ushers you inside one of these homes, and suddenly you're surrounded by the clink of china, the glint of silver cutlery, and the nervous coughs of children sitting stiffly in high-backed chairs. The middle-class Victorian dinner is a theater of status. The food is certainly richer than what you've seen among workers, but it's also carefully curated to show off ambition. Here's your mainstream fact. Middle-class Victorian households followed a formal structure for dinner, often modeled after aristocratic traditions. Meals could stretch across multiple courses: soup, fish, meat, pudding, dessert, each served in turn, though scaled down compared to wealthy estates. Even the order of dishes mattered. To serve things out of order was to risk embarrassment, a faux pas worse than overcooked beef. The meal begins with soup, maybe a clear broth or a pea puree, followed by fish, haddock or cod, simply prepared but served with lemon slices to add refinement. Then comes the main attraction: roasted beef, mutton, or pork, surrounded by potatoes and carrots glazed in butter. Plates are set with precision, and the conversation is just as carefully managed. Children are told to eat quietly, while adults discuss politics, novels, or the latest railway news. And then the puddings arrive. Sweet or savory, puddings were a Victorian obsession. Suet puddings steamed for hours, dense enough to double as building materials. Spotted dick, treacle sponge, plum puddings, all heavy, filling, and dripping with syrup or custard. Imagine ending every dinner with dessert that could serve as both meal and paperweight. Now for a quirky tidbit, some middle-class families, eager to appear fashionable, embrace tinned food with almost reckless enthusiasm. Tinned pineapple, tinned salmon, even tinned turtle soup were paraded onto tables, sometimes to the bewilderment of guests. The craze for exotic canned goods meant that a family in Birmingham might serve fruit from Jamaica or fish from Canada, all without leaving their parlor. One recorded dinner party ended with guests politely pretending to enjoy a dessert of tinned peaches drowned in beef jelly. Not exactly a recipe for success, unless the goal was confusion. Of course, not every middle-class dinner was grand. On weekdays, many households dined on plain fare: chops, potatoes, and bread, enlivened with gravy. But Sundays were different. Sunday dinner was the Victorian showpiece, the day when roasts ruled the table, and neighbors peered out their windows to see who was carrying home the largest joint of meat. The smell of roasting beef on a Sunday became so universal that one writer joked you could tell the Sabbath by the scent alone. Here's where historians still argue. Was the middle-class diet genuinely healthier than that of the working poor? Or was it just more varied? Some studies suggest middle-class families had better access to meat and dairy, giving them an edge in nutrition. Others argue that the heavy reliance on puddings, fats, and sugar created a different set of health problems: indigestion, gout, and a tendency toward plumpness in later life. As the meal continues, you notice the rituals extend beyond the food. Napkins are folded just so, servants wait silently to remove plates, and children must not speak unless spoken to. Dining here is training in manners, a rehearsal for the social climbing that defines so much of Victorian ambition. A middle-class dinner wasn't just about what you ate, it was about how gracefully you ate it. Still, the food had to taste good, and when it did, the table came alive. Imagine the burst of laughter when someone spills a drop of gravy. The satisfied hums as custard is spooned over steaming sponge. A glass of sherry is poured for the adults, and tea follows to settle the stomach after so much richness. You lean back, half dazed by the sheer weight of it all, and glance at the sideboard where more tins are stacked like trophies. Pineapples, peaches, salmon, all waiting for another chance to dazzle guests. The host notices your look and chuckles, proudly declaring, "Modern science, bringing the world to our table." You smile politely, though privately you think, maybe the world could have stayed in its own tin. As the clock ticks toward evening, the candles are lit and the children are sent upstairs. The table is cleared and conversation drifts into politics again. The food has done its work, not just nourishing bodies, but staging the drama of respectability. Tomorrow they'll return to plain suppers, but tonight, the memory of puddings and roast beef lingers. Morning light drifts across fields instead of factories now, and the air is sharper, fresher, free from the black coal dust that choke the cities. You've left the crowded streets behind and find yourself in a small village, where cottages lean together like old friends and farmyards stretch into patchwork fields. Here, survival looks different. People eat what the land gives them: potatoes, milk, butter, and whatever can be coaxed from soil that doesn't always want to cooperate. Rural diets weren't glamorous, but at least they had a bit more color than endless gray gruel. You step into a cottage kitchen, low-ceilinged and smoky from the hearth fire. A pot hangs over the flames, bubbling gently. Inside, root vegetables, mostly potatoes, with some leeks and a carrot or two. If it smells hearty, that's because it is. For many rural families, potatoes were the backbone of the diet. Boiled, mashed, roasted in ashes, cheap, filling, and versatile. A family could live on potatoes and milk for weeks if they had to, and often they did. Here's the mainstream fact. By the mid-19th century, potatoes had become a staple across Britain, not just in Ireland. They provided more calories per acre than wheat and were far easier for small farmers to grow. Add a bit of butter or milk, and you had something close to a complete meal. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept bodies moving. But diets here weren't just potatoes. Cows and goats supplied milk, which could be turned into butter, cream, and cheese. Eggs from chickens offered variety. Forage foods padded out the menu. Nettles boiled into soup, mushrooms picked from damp fields, berries gathered in hedgerows. If you knew the land, you could find a snack in almost every season. Children would wander out with baskets and return with hazelnuts, sloes, or wild apples, sticky with juice. And here's your quirky tidbit. Rural families had preservation tricks that sound a little bizarre to modern ears. One method involved packing butter into wooden tubs and sealing it under brine, creating a salty, funky spread that could last months. Another? Storing eggs by coating them in lard or burying them in lime powder. Imagine digging up your breakfast like a fossil. But hey, it worked. Meals were simple but steady. Breakfast might be porridge made with oats or barley, eaten with milk. Lunch, often called dinner in the countryside, was the big meal centered on potatoes, bread, and occasionally pork or bacon. Supper was lighter, maybe bread and cheese or leftover pottage. Families often cooked once a day, then reheated portions from the big pot that simmered perpetually on the hearth. That pot was the beating heart of the kitchen, seasoned not just with herbs but with years of smoke and use. Of course, harvest time meant feast time. When crops came in, people celebrated with fresh bread, roast meats, and puddings stuffed with apples or currants. It was the one season when tables groaned with abundance and neighbors shared dishes across hedges. But once winter tightened its grip, meals grew leaner, and survival meant stretching what you'd stored. Salted pork hung in the rafters, potatoes were kept in cool cellars, and carrots were buried in sand to keep them crisp. You learn to get creative when the snow falls. Historians still argue whether rural diets were healthier than urban ones. Some point to the availability of fresh milk, eggs, and vegetables as proof that villagers had a nutritional advantage. Others argue that poverty often forced rural families to sell their best produce, leaving them with the scraps. A farmer might sell cream at market and feed his own children watered-down skim milk. Was life in the countryside really better, or just a different flavor of hardship? Even so, there were pleasures. On Sundays, families often cooked bacon with cabbage, letting the fat flavor the greens. A pot of dumplings might float on top of a stew, puffed up with flour and suet. Bread, when baked at home, smelled heavenly and came out of ovens golden, not chalky like the city loaves. And butter churned in the kitchen had a richness you couldn't fake. Children dart in and out of the cottage, grabbing slices of bread thick with dripping before running to the fields. You join them briefly, stepping into the crisp air where rows of cabbages line the soil. Women bend to gather greens, while men lift sacks of turnips. It's hard work, but at least you can see exactly where your food comes from. No mystery pies, no coffin soup, just dirt under your fingernails and dinner in your basket. Sometimes, though, even the best-laid plans went wrong. Crop failures meant hunger, and families might spend weeks living on little more than potatoes boiled with salt. If disease hit livestock, milk vanished from the table overnight. The countryside looked idyllic, but survival was always on a knife edge. And if you think chewing through endless potatoes sounds dull, imagine doing it for months, praying the next harvest would be kinder. As dusk falls, the cottage hearth glows brighter, and the day's meal is ladled out in steaming bowls. Potatoes, cabbage, a chunk of bacon if fortune smiled, and maybe a spoonful of pickled beetroot to brighten the plate. You sit cross-legged on the bench, the rough wood beneath you, and take a bite. It's earthy, honest, and filling. For now, that's enough. The fire in the cottage hearth burns low, and outside the evening chill presses against the windows. You notice a cradle tucked in the corner, a baby swaddled tightly, its breath puffing softly in the dim light. Life in the Victorian countryside, and the cities too, wasn't just about keeping adults alive. It was about figuring out how to feed the smallest and most fragile mouths. And that was often a story of improvisation, risk, and no small amount of debate. You lean closer, and the mother gently lifts the baby, settling into a chair with practiced weariness. If she's lucky, she can nurse the child herself. But what if she can't? Breastfeeding was often expected, but poverty, poor health, or endless work hours meant many mothers couldn't manage. That's where wet nurses came in, women who were paid to nurse another's child, often while still feeding their own. In wealthier households, it was a mark of status to hire a wet nurse. Among poorer families, it was sheer survival when a mother was too weak or absent. Here's your mainstream fact. Victorian infant mortality was staggeringly high. In some industrial towns, up to 1 in 3 children didn't survive past their 5th birthday. Malnutrition was a major culprit, and what babies ate or didn't eat was at the heart of it. When breast milk wasn't available, families turned to pap or panada, soft mixtures made from bread soaked in water or milk, sometimes sweetened with a dab of sugar or honey. Imagine a spoonful of soggy bread mush being your first taste of life. Sometimes it was mixed with beer, wine, or even opium-laced syrup sold as soothing medicine for infants. Not exactly the ideal baby formula. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some families believed that porridge should be chewed first by the mother and then passed to the baby, pre-softened in her mouth. Sort of an early, slightly unsettling form of baby food processing. It wasn't widespread, but it shows just how far people were willing to go to make solid food digestible for little ones. You watch as the mother stirs a pot of oats over the fire. For older children, porridge was the standard breakfast, thick and filling, eaten with milk if available. Children could eat bowls of it daily, and though it was monotonous, at least it provided steady energy. The smell of oats and smoke fills the room, and you realize this was the Victorian equivalent of cereal. Cheap, repetitive, but crucial. Children also drank plenty of milk, though not always safely. Without refrigeration, milk soured quickly, and urban supplies were sometimes watered down by unscrupulous sellers. There were even reports of swill milk, produced by cows kept in filthy city dairies and fed on brewery waste. Babies drinking it often became sick, but parents bought it because it was cheap. Historians still argue whether swill milk was the silent killer of many infants, or just one hazard among many in a city already full of risks. In the countryside, children had better odds. They drank fresh milk from the family cow or goat, ate eggs from the yard, and snacked on boiled potatoes dipped in salt. When berries ripened, children stained their faces purple from gorging on blackberries. Rural kids might have had fewer toys, but at least their snacks grew on bushes. But even in villages, food scarcity hit children hardest. Adults could tighten belts, but babies couldn't wait. Families sometimes weaned children early, switching them to bread, gruel, or tea mixed with milk. Yes, even toddlers drank weak tea, their tiny hands clutching mugs almost bigger than their heads. It soothed hunger, if not always healthfully. The scholarly debate here is poignant. Did Victorian parents neglect their children by feeding them inadequate diets, or were they simply trapped by poverty and bad options? Some historians argue that ignorance of nutrition played a big role. Parents didn't realize watered-down milk lacked the vitamins children needed. Others insist parents knew but had no choice. When survival is a daily negotiation, ideals about child-rearing fall to the side. Still, you catch glimpses of joy. A mother smiling as her child licks porridge from the spoon. A father saving a scrap of bacon rind to flavor the children's supper. Families shared what little they had, even if it meant parents going hungry so children could eat. And then there were the treats. On rare market days, a child might get a penny to buy a sweet, barley sugar twisted into sticks, humbug striped with color, or treacle licked from a spoon. Sticky fingers, wide eyes. That taste of sugar could be the highlight of an entire season. Back in the cottage, the children curl up after their porridge supper, stomachs warmed if not full. The baby sighs softly, finally asleep, and the parents look at each other across the hearth, weary but relieved. For tonight at least, everyone has eaten. Tomorrow they'll figure it out all over again. The cottage fades behind you, and soon the air thickens again with the smells of the town. Smoke, horses, damp stone, and somewhere close by, the unmistakable odor of cooking meat, or at least parts of meat you might not normally brag about eating. Here in the alleys and small kitchens of working-class Britain, the scraps and leftovers of the animal take center stage. If the wealthy dined on prime roasts and fillets, the poor survived on everything else. Offal, bones, skins, and organ meats turned into meals through sheer determination and creativity. You follow the scent to a tiny cook shop where a bubbling pot of pottage simmers. This was the catch-all stew of the Victorian poor, a dish that could stretch to feed many mouths. The ingredients: whatever you had: cabbage leaves, barley, carrots, bones with a little meat still clinging, and often the stranger parts of the animal. Hearts, lungs, tripe, kidneys, livers, nothing went to waste. The stew cooked for hours, thickening until it was less a soup and more a sludge. Rich with flavor, if you were lucky, but just as often a gray mystery bowl. Here's your mainstream fact. Offal was so common among the working classes that entire markets specialized in it. London's Smithfield Market, for instance, sold tons of tripe and chitterlings daily, supplying cheap protein to the city's poorest residents. These cuts were far cheaper than beefsteak or pork chops, and often the only affordable meat option. But sometimes necessity birthed unexpected traditions. Tripe shops became popular in northern towns, serving stewed tripe with onions or fried in batter. Cow heel soup was a favorite in parts of Lancashire, prized for its gelatinous texture and supposed health benefits. And in Scotland, the famous haggis, a mixture of sheep organs, oatmeal, and spices, wasn't just a national dish, but also a practical way to use everything at hand. Now for your quirky tidbit, one odd invention of the period was mock turtle soup, made from a calf's head to imitate the luxurious green turtle soup that aristocrats adored. The head was boiled, the brains and other bits incorporated, and voila, an affordable imitation of a rich man's delicacy. Imagine sitting down to a steaming bowl and being told cheerily, "Don't worry, it's not turtle, it's calf's face." Appetite restored? Maybe not. Pottage wasn't just an urban dish, though. Rural families made their own versions, especially when meat was scarce. Vegetables, grains, and the occasional bone went into the pot, which stayed on the hearth day and night. Leftovers were simply added back in, creating a stew that was never quite the same 2 days in a row. If you've ever tried stone soup as a parable, this was the lived reality. Everyone contributing scraps to keep the communal pot going. Of course, not everyone celebrated these meals. Some middle-class reformers looked at the diets of the poor with horror, declaring that organ meats were unwholesome or even dangerous for children. Others, however, praised them as cheap and nourishing. Historians still argue whether offal-based diets were genuinely nutritious or whether the constant reliance on them left working families chronically underfed. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. The body can survive on liver and onions, but it's hardly the balanced diet a doctor would prescribe. For many, though, food was less about health than about filling the belly. Children grew up gnawing marrow from bones, licking the fat from scraps, and learning to appreciate flavors most modern eaters would reject. Picture a 10-year-old proudly carrying home a bag of sheep's trotters from the market, grinning as though it were a prize. And in a way it was. Another layer of survival was seasoning. A pinch of salt, a bit of mustard, or a splash of vinegar could make awful dishes more palatable. Suet, rendered animal fat, was a godsend, not only for frying, but also for patting out puddings, dumplings, and crusts. A suet pudding might contain nothing but flour, fat, and a bit of syrup, yet it became a beloved comfort food, steaming hot and heavy enough to stick with you through a long shift. Still, there were moments of culinary ingenuity. Recipes circulated for economical pies, where the filling might be a medley of potatoes, onions, and just enough meat scraps to provide flavor. Fish heads became soup. Pig's blood turned into black pudding. The philosophy was simple. If it came from the animal, it could be eaten. Waste was a luxury no one could afford. In some towns, you might even find stalls selling pea soup and saveloys, thick pea porridge ladled out with cheap sausages. For a penny, it was hot, salty, and sustaining. Street children slurped it down, wiping noses on sleeves, before darting off to sell matches or shine boots. Not exactly the Victorian version of fast food, but close enough. You lean over the steaming pot of pottage, the smell of boiled onions and marrow rising like a fog. The taste, when you sip, is surprisingly rich, earthy, with a faint tang of vinegar cutting through the heaviness. Not elegant, but satisfying in its own stubborn way. This was the flavor of resilience, of families who refused to starve even when the best cuts were far out of reach. As you leave the cook shop, a boy passes, carrying a tray of pies, their crusts glistening in the lamplight. Inside, probably awful, but wrapped in golden pastry, seasoned and hot, they look tempting. And for a penny or two, that's dinner. Once again, survival is a question of appetite and imagination. You wander back into the clamor of the high street, and there it is again. The sound of cups clinking, kettles hissing, spoons tapping against porcelain. If one thing defined the rhythm of Victorian daily life, it was tea. The humble leaf, carried halfway across the world in crates stamped with exotic port names, became the fuel that kept the empire ticking, from factory girl to queen. And alongside tea came its inseparable companion, sugar. Together, they weren't just food, they were habit, comfort, addiction, and status. You duck into a crowded tea shop, its windows fogged with steam. Inside, women in shawls sit shoulder to shoulder, sipping from thick mugs, while a clerk at the counter shovels loose tea into paper packets for customers to take home. For the poor, tea was the cheapest luxury, a drink that warmed, soothed, and provided a momentary escape from the grind. Here's your mainstream fact. By the mid-19th century, Britain was importing hundreds of millions of pounds of tea annually, largely from China and later from India and Ceylon. The average working-class family spent a significant chunk of its weekly budget on tea and sugar, often prioritizing them over more nutritious foods. Sugar sweetened not just tea but also porridge, puddings, and even bread spread with dripping. Children were pacified with lumps of sugar to suck on, a primitive version of a lollipop. And of course, sugar-powered industry too, not the machines themselves, but the workers who needed a jolt of energy to keep going through 14-hour shifts. Imagine a miner pulling a lump of sugar from his pocket, crunching it like candy between shovel loads. Not glamorous, but it kept the calories flowing. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some people swore by tea with bread crusts, where leftover crusts were steeped directly in the teapot alongside the leaves. The result? A starchy, soggy infusion that was equal parts drink and snack. It was frugal, filling, and only mildly horrifying if you picture the mush at the bottom of the pot. Tea wasn't just about the drink, though. It was about ritual. Even the poorest families aspired to a tea table, complete with mismatched cups, a pot covered in a knitted cozy, and maybe a plate of bread or a sliver of cheese. For the middle classes, tea became an elaborate performance. Tiered stands with scones and sandwiches, fine china, silver spoons polished until you could see your face. One was survival, the other was theater. Historians still argue whether sugar was a blessing or a curse. On the one hand, it provided cheap, quick energy at a time when people needed every calorie they could get. On the other, it fueled tooth decay, obesity, and what some scholars call the beginnings of modern dietary imbalance. Was sugar the great equalizer that gave poor families a daily indulgence? Or the silent poison that reshaped British health forever? No consensus yet, and maybe never. You sip from a chipped mug, the tea strong and dark, sweetened until it coats your tongue. It's not gourmet, but in this world it's comfort, and comfort is survival. Around you, women gossip about factory hours, men plan their next shift, and children dunk crusts of bread into their mother's cup, grinning through sticky lips. For a few minutes, life feels gentler. Tea also connected the kitchen to the empire. Every sip carried traces of distant plantations, colonial labor, and trade routes stretching across oceans. Few Victorians thought much about the people who picked those leaves or cut that cane, but the empire was on every table. Disguised as a simple drink, the global sat right there in your saucer. And when the kettle whistled in a tiny back kitchen, or when a hostess poured with practiced grace in a parlor, the meaning was the same. A small pause, a reset, a reminder that even in hunger, there was room for ritual. As you step back into the evening street, the smell of roasting chestnuts mingles with the faint, tannic aroma of tea drifting from open doorways. You carry the taste with you, sweet and faintly bitter, like the Victorian world itself. You walk on, the night air thickening with smoke and chatter, until you catch the scent of something yeasty, almost sweet. A cluster of men gathers outside a public house, tankards in hand, laughter spilling into the street. Step inside and you're hit with the aroma of malt and hops, damp wood, and humanity packed shoulder to shoulder. This is the other great river running through Victorian diets: beer, ale, and the occasional scandalous gin. For much of the century, plain water was suspect. In towns where sewage flowed into rivers and hand pumps drew from contaminated wells, people had good reason to avoid it. Beer, by contrast, had been boiled during brewing, making it relatively safe. Children drank small beer, a weak brew with barely more alcohol than modern kombucha. Adults swigged stronger stuff, not always to get drunk, but simply because it was safer and tastier than what came from the tap. Here's your mainstream fact. Beer consumption in Britain peaked in the mid-19th century, with average adults drinking gallons per week, woven into meals as casually as we drink soda or coffee today. But it wasn't just beer. Gin, infamous from the earlier gin craze of the 18th century, still lurked in cheap shops tucked into alleys. Sold by the glass, gin was the quick escape of the desperate, often caricatured in satirical prints as the ruin of families. The government passed multiple gin acts to control sales, and yet a penny dram could still be found by anyone who needed to forget hunger for an hour. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some workers carried vinegar and water mixtures in bottles, calling it switchel or haymaker's punch. Supposedly refreshing, it was cheap to make and easier to stomach than lukewarm water. Imagine clocking out of a factory, wiping soot from your brow, and gulping vinegar water as a treat. Tastes evolve, clearly. Beer and gin weren't the only drinks on offer. Cider flowed in rural regions, particularly in the West Country, where laborers were sometimes paid partly in drink. Weak porter or stout might be handed out to dock workers at lunchtime, ensuring just enough buzz to soften the grind but not enough to stop the work. Drink was calorie as much as it was indulgence. Still, not everyone approved. Temperance societies sprang up across Britain, championed by reformers who believed alcohol was at the root of poverty and sin. Meetings were held where men and women pledged lifelong abstinence, signing their names or marking with an X if they couldn't write. Yet even as reformers railed against it, public houses thrived and barrels kept rolling. Historians still argue whether alcohol was more destructive or sustaining in Victorian life. Was it fueling ruin, or was it simply another way to make survival bearable? You take a sip from a mug of small beer, the taste earthy, faintly sour, barely alcoholic. Children drank this without a second thought, and for many it was their first introduction to grown-up food. Later, as they grew, the mugs simply got stronger. The line between nutrition and vice blurred with every swallow. Inside the pub, men share crusts of bread and cheese along with their pints. Women might be found in gin palaces, lavishly decorated shops with mirrors and chandeliers, selling cheap gin by the glass. The contrast is striking. Ornate surroundings for a drink that often led to despair. Outside, reformers hand out pamphlets warning of alcohol's dangers, while inside, laughter drowns them out. And then there's the humor. One wag quips that beer was so essential, workers might strike if denied their daily pint. Another insists gin was simply liquid courage, a necessity before proposing to a sweetheart or facing down a landlord. Jokes aside, drink carried both risk and relief in every mug. As you leave the warmth of the public house, the cool night air sobers you instantly. Behind you, mugs clink, laughter rises, and the smell of hops drifts out into the lamplight. Whether savior or scourge, alcohol was stitched into daily survival, and no Victorian life was untouched by it. The tavern door closes behind you, and now the night feels quieter, though the rattle of carts and the clip of horses still echo down cobbled streets. Your feet carry you toward the docks where the smell changes: salt, tar, and something metallic. Here, ships unload barrels, crates, and tin containers that shimmer faintly under lantern light. This is where another revolution in Victorian eating takes shape: preservation. Salted, smoked, canned, or imported from halfway across the globe, preserved foods stretch survival beyond the seasons. even if flavor was sometimes the casualty. You watch dock workers hoist barrels of salted fish, their arms straining as brine drips down onto the planks. Fish was a staple for much of the working class, but not the kind you might imagine grilled on a seaside holiday. Instead, it was often dried cod, salted herring, or kippers smoked until their smell could cling to your clothes for days. Cheap, abundant, and durable preserved fish traveled far inland to tables that otherwise would rarely taste the sea. Here's your mainstream fact. The development of large-scale canning in the early 19th century, pioneered in France and quickly adopted in Britain, transformed diets by making meat, vegetables, and soups shelf-stable for months or years. By the 1850s, tinned foods were appearing not just in naval stores and military rations, but also in civilian shops, where adventurous or desperate families tried them out. You peer at a gleaming tin on a grocer's shelf. Inside, maybe stewed mutton, maybe condensed milk, maybe potted meat that was a little too smooth for comfort. Soldiers in the Crimean War ate tons of the stuff, while explorers like those heading for the Arctic swore by canned provisions as lifelines in frozen wastelands. Ordinary families experimented too, though not without suspicion. Tins occasionally exploded, seams burst, or, worse, contents spoiled with fatal consequences. Here's your quirky tidbit. One preservation method used in poorer homes was bottle beef, where meat was stuffed into glass bottles, sealed with suet or fat, and kept in cool pantries. It looked vaguely like a Victorian lava lamp, chunks of meat suspended in jelly, but it stretched protein a little further. Not exactly appetizing, but survival rarely wins beauty contests. Salt remained the oldest and most reliable friend of preservation. Meats were salted, butter was salted, and even vegetables were brined in barrels. Pickled cabbage, onions, and cucumbers added tang to otherwise bland diets. And sauerkraut wasn't just for Germans. It popped up in British kitchens too, though with less flair. Smoking and drying extended the life of sausages and bacon, which dangled from hooks in kitchens, the fat glistening in the firelight. Trade routes added another layer of strangeness and luxury. Ships brought rice from India, spices from Ceylon, and even pineapples, though only the very wealthy could afford to display one on the dinner table as a centerpiece. For ordinary families, it was more likely to be cheap imported flour, tins of treacle, or dried fruit from overseas. These imports added variety, but they also underscored how dependent Britain was on global networks. Every bite carried a faint taste of empire, whether people realized it or not. Historians still argue about canned food's impact. Some say it democratized diets, making meat and exotic ingredients available to the masses for the first time. Others insist it was slow to take off outside the army, with most working-class families sticking to familiar, fresh but perishable staples until well into the late century. The truth is likely a mix. Preservation was a miracle in theory, but in practice, trust in tins took decades to build. You crouch beside a barrel where fish heads bob in brine, eyes glassy, lips curled in silent surprise. The smell is overwhelming, but when you think about a family inland opening that same barrel, frying the fish with onions, and serving it alongside potatoes, the image softens. Preservation wasn't glamorous, but it meant the difference between dinner and an empty plate. In some homes, you'd find dripping jars, containers for the fat skimmed-off roasted meat, stored to flavor future meals. Even tea could be preserved of sorts. Bricks of compressed leaves traveled across oceans, wrapped tight against moisture, to be broken down into daily rituals months later. Preservation was everywhere, visible and invisible, holding together diets that might otherwise collapse under scarcity. You pick up a tin, shake it gently, and listen to the slosh inside. Somewhere, someone will open this weeks from now, perhaps in a cramped London kitchen or a farmhouse deep in Yorkshire, and they'll be grateful it's there. In the Victorian world, the future often came with a seal and a key to pry it open. You leave the docks behind, the salty tang fading as the streets narrow and the houses grow closer together. Smoke curls from chimneys, though not everyone inside has something to cook. Hunger isn't just an occasional visitor here, it's a permanent tenant. When families couldn't stretch their bread, when potatoes were gone, or when wages disappeared after an accident or dismissal, there was one fragile safety net left: charity. You turn a corner and see a queue forming outside a brick building. Men, women, and children stand with bowls or tins clutched in their hands, waiting for the doors to open. This is a soup kitchen, one of thousands that sprang up across Britain during hard times. Inside, giant vats of broth simmer, ladled out with practiced speed. Thin, hot, and salty, it's not much, but it's a lifeline. Here's your mainstream fact. During the Irish famine in the 1840s, soup kitchens became a central strategy for relief, feeding millions at the height of the crisis. The model spread across Britain, where urban poverty made similar measures necessary during slumps and strikes. The soup itself was usually a mix of barley, peas, onions, and sometimes a hint of meat. Economical, easy to cook in bulk, and vaguely nutritious, it kept people alive when wages or food prices made self-cooking impossible. Reformers praised it as practical, though critics sniffed that it bred dependency. To you, standing in line with the crowd, it just looks like survival. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some kitchens issued tokens instead of serving first come, first served. Families had to present stamped metal discs or paper chits, often distributed after proving their poverty. It was a bureaucratic little ticket to dinner, turning charity into something halfway between a meal and a train ride. Inside, volunteers ladle steaming broth into bowls. Children clutch theirs tightly, slurping it down before leaving the building, broth dripping onto their sleeves. Parents might stretch their portions, sipping slowly, already calculating how long the energy will last before hunger returns. The air smells of boiled vegetables and damp wool, a kind of institutional scent, half kitchen, half waiting room. Beyond soup kitchens, there were relief societies, churches, and philanthropic groups offering bread, coal, or occasional parcels of meat. The Salvation Army, founded in 1865, became famous for its Food for the Hungry programs, though even before its rise, dozens of local charities ran similar efforts. Some handed out penny dinners, where a child could buy a hot plate of food for a token coin. Historians still argue about the motives of such charities. Were they genuine efforts to help the poor, or moral campaigns to regulate their behavior? Rules often accompanied meals: no drunkenness, no swearing, sometimes even mandatory prayers before eating. For some, charity was survival with strings attached, a reminder that generosity came wrapped in judgment. In workhouse towns, soup distribution could blur into poor law relief. Guardians sometimes opened temporary kitchens during crises, though critics accused them of being stingy or deliberately unappetizing to discourage dependence. The thinness of the broth became almost symbolic, nourishment carefully calibrated to sustain life, but never to encourage it. Still, for those in line, the symbolism didn't matter. A hot ladle of soup on a winter evening could mean children slept with full bellies instead of crying. Bread dipped into broth softened into something filling, and for a moment, the ache of hunger receded. You pause by the door as volunteers scrub the great cauldrons clean, preparing for tomorrow. Their movements are weary but practiced. This isn't a one-time effort, but a daily grind of its own. The line outside may shift in faces, but it never truly disappears. As you step back into the cool air, you imagine the ripple effect. One bowl of soup keeping a man strong enough to return to work, a child healthy enough to attend school, a mother with just enough energy to face another day. Charity may not solve the roots of poverty, but in the moment, it could mean everything. The soup kitchen fades behind you, and you follow the alleys deeper into the city, where the glow of lamps weakens and the smells shift. Here, food isn't neatly ladled into bowls. It's scavenged, scraped, rescued from the edges of waste. Hunger teaches sharp eyes and quick hands. And in these narrow streets, survival means foraging in places most would rather not look. You pass a child crouched by a gutter, scraping crumbs of coal from spilled ash. Not food, but tradable, and anything tradable could buy a crust of bread. Nearby, a woman rummages through a butcher's bin, pulling out bones slick with scraps of fat. With enough boiling, those bones will yield broth, a meal built from refuse, but still a meal. Here's your mainstream fact. Victorian cities produced mountains of waste, and scavenging became a recognized part of the urban economy. Bone pickers, rag gatherers, and toshers, who hunted for valuables in sewers, formed an informal network that fed both industries and households. For poor families, gleaning from refuse was often the first line of defense against hunger. Sometimes the hunt extended to animal keeping in the unlikeliest corners. Families in slums raised pigs in backyards or even inside homes, feeding them scraps and chamber pot contents. House pigs, as they were sometimes called, were noisy, smelly, and occasionally stolen by neighbors. But when slaughtered, they provided weeks of meat and fat. Chickens scratched in alleys, and goats nibbled weeds beside crumbling walls. Their milk a secret treasure for children. Here's your quirky tidbit. In parts of London, families reportedly kept bees in cramped yards, not for honey but for wax, which they sold to candle makers. The honey, when available, was a sweet bonus, a little jar of gold in the middle of great poverty. Imagine sipping weak tea with a rare spoonful of honey stirred in, savoring sweetness snatched from rooftops. The scavenger's diet often meant braving stigma, picking cabbage leaves from a market stall floor, salvaging bruised fruit discarded at closing time, even scraping crumbs of sweet from bakery trays. These acts weren't romanticized, they were necessities. Families stretched what they found with flour, potatoes, or porridge oats, turning scraps into stews and puddings. Historians still argue whether scavenging should be seen as resourceful ingenuity or as a damning sign of systemic failure. Some frame it as resilience, the ability of the poor to survive against impossible odds. Others insist it shows how deeply society neglected its most vulnerable, leaving them to root through refuse for sustenance. You can almost hear the debate carried in the clatter of tin cans down the alley. Night deepens, and you trail behind a group of ragged boys. They dart toward a bakery just as the shutters close. The baker, sympathetic or simply resigned, tosses out a tray of burned crusts. The boys pounce, stuffing them into sacks and mouths alike. To an onlooker, it looks chaotic, but to them, it's bounty. They'll take home what they can, share with siblings, and for once fall asleep with something solid in their stomachs. In rural areas, foraging was different but no less vital. Families gathered mushrooms, nettles, dandelion greens, berries, and nuts. Some picked acorns, grinding them into flour when wheat ran out. Riverbanks yielded watercress, a peppery green that became so associated with the poor, it was nicknamed the poor man's bread. Children sold bunches of it in the streets, their voices thin. Watercress, fresh watercress. And then there were the more dubious finds. Rats, though not common fare, sometimes ended up on plates during desperate times. In Paris, they became a wartime delicacy. In Victorian Britain, more of a whispered possibility. But hunger made lines blur. Cats and dogs? Rarely, though rumors swirled. More common was the reuse of kitchen grease, scooped from gutters or collected from taverns to flavor otherwise bland meals. You duck into another yard and find a family gathered around a pot. Inside, bones from the butcher's bin simmer with barley and carrots rescued from the market floor. The smell is surprisingly pleasant, savory and warm. The children's eyes follow the ladle eagerly, and when their bowls are filled, they gulp it down without hesitation. In this world, waste wasn't waste until it was truly gone. Every scrap of fat, every peel, every crust could be stretched. The idea of throwing food away would have seemed scandalous. Survival depended on seeing value where others saw garbage. As you step back into the alley, the sounds of scavenging still echo. Metal clinks, whispers, the rustle of sacks. It's not glamorous, but it's survival, raw and unvarnished. In Victorian cities, even the rubbish heaps had their own strange economy, feeding those who could find treasure in trash. You leave the alleys behind and wander toward a brighter stretch of the city, where gas lamps flare and the sound of laughter spills from shop fronts. Hunger still lurks everywhere, but in this corner, there's a different kind of survival, one painted with sugar and flour. For all the gloom of workhouses and scavenged scraps, the Victorian era also birthed cheap treats, little edible luxuries that gave people a taste of joy amid hardship. Children swarm around a stall where jars gleam like jewels. Rock candy sticks, humbugs, aniseed twists, and licorice ropes coil in glass containers. For a farthing, a child could buy a sweet and let it dissolve slowly, stretching a single bite into minutes of happiness. You watch their eyes widen as they press noses to glass, coins clutched in sweaty palms. Here's your mainstream fact. The expansion of the sugar trade in the 19th century made sweets affordable for the working class. By mid-century, Britain's per capita sugar consumption had skyrocketed, fueled by imports from colonies and by advances in refining. Sweets shifted from elite indulgence to everyday treat, especially for children. Of course, not every sweet was made equal. Rock candy and boiled sweets were cheap to produce, often colored with dubious additives like red lead or copper compounds to make them vibrant. Children didn't know or care that their jawbreakers might double as a chemistry experiment. A sticky tongue was worth the risk. And here's your quirky tidbit. One popular penny treat was the treacle stick, a hard candy flavored with thick syrup. But in some markets, sellers didn't bother with sticks. They sold treacle by the spoonful, dolloped straight into a child's hand or onto bread. Imagine sticky fingers glued together, a sugary glue that no parent could fully wash off. Street sellers pushed more than candy. Hot spiced nuts, they called, paper cones rustling in the dark. Penny pies, shouted another, offering tiny meat pies barely larger than your palm. Chestnut vendors roasted their wares over glowing braziers, the smell warm and smoky, promising comfort on a damp evening. These weren't meals, but they were filling enough to hold off hunger's worst edge. Bakeries joined in, selling day-old buns for half price. Gingerbread men, fruit tarts, and Eccles cakes appeared on counters, affordable in small doses. Even the poorest family might scrape together pennies for a Sunday treat, a way to sweeten the week's relentless grind. Historians still argue whether cheap sweets harm working-class diets more than they helped. Some say sugar filled stomachs but crowded out nutrition, contributing to poor teeth and weak bodies. Others point out that morale mattered too, that a sweet in a child's hand or a bun on a Sunday could mean a kind of survival that wasn't just physical, but emotional. You stroll past a theater crowd spilling into the street. Vendors hawk oranges to the audience, the fruit glowing like lanterns in the night. Oranges were luxury items once, but by the late century, imports made them attainable for the middle and even lower classes. For a moment, someone biting into a juicy orange could taste sunshine from Spain or the Caribbean, even in a soot-choked London winter. In another stall, a boy clutches a paper twist of sherbet powder. He dips a licorice stick inside and licks, his tongue coated in fizzy sweetness. His laughter bubbles up like the sherbet itself, careless and loud. You can't help but smile. Here's joy distilled, sold for a penny. The contrast is striking. A few streets back, families boil bones for broth. Here, children lick sugar off their fingers with glee. Both are survival, but one feeds the belly, the other feeds the spirit. And sometimes that's just as important. As you turn away, the voices of sellers follow you, rhythmic as a lullaby. Toffee, hot chestnuts, penny buns. The Victorian night hums with small delights, reminders that even in an age of want, people found ways to taste sweetness, to pause the hunger, to let life feel bearable for a moment longer. The night grows quiet now, the streets thinning, the gas lamps dimming as the city exhales. You've walked from kitchens to taverns, from markets to alleys, and what lingers most isn't a single dish or flavor. It's the relentlessness. Eating in the Victorian era wasn't a guarantee. It was a negotiation, a daily dance with scarcity, ingenuity, and luck. You pause at the edge of a darkened square where a few figures huddle under blankets, their meals for the day long gone. Hunger remains their companion tonight, and it's sobering. But around the corner, in another house, a family sits with steaming bowls of stew, bread on the table, children licking treacle from their fingers. Same city, same moment, yet utterly different worlds. Here's your mainstream fact. The Victorians lived through profound shifts in food access, shaped by industrialization, empire, and urbanization. Diets changed more between 1830 and 1900 than in many centuries prior. From tinned meat to cheap sugar, the food landscape was unrecognizable by the century's end. But not all transformations reached everyone equally. The wealthy gorged on multi-course feasts, while the poor sometimes dined on little more than watercress and bread. Even with soup kitchens, scavenging, and penny treats, malnutrition remained common. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was a map of inequality. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some towns, bakers made penny loaves deliberately undersized to cheat customers. Children would line up, coins clutched tight, and walk away with bread that looked bigger in the window than in their hands. Complaints arose often, but bakers shrugged. It was survival for them too. Historians still argue whether the Victorian diet truly improved over the century. Some emphasize the new availability of cheap calories, bread, potatoes, sugar, that reduced famine deaths. Others note that nutrition remained poor, with deficiencies like rickets widespread. The answer, like the meals themselves, is mixed. You think back on what you've seen: the bread queues, the fishmongers, the dripping jars, the penny sweets. You can almost taste it all layered together: salt, smoke, sugar, soot. For the Victorians, food was never far from thought, because hunger was never far from reality. Survival meant making do, stretching scraps, swallowing pride, and sometimes savoring small pleasures that felt impossibly sweet. And now, as the city sleeps, you're left with one last image: a child curled in bed, belly just full enough, dreaming not of riches, but of tomorrow's loaf, tomorrow's broth, tomorrow's chance to eat again. And now, with the lamps flickering low and the city fading into quiet shadows, you can let the sounds of that Victorian world drift further away. Imagine the bustle of markets softening, the clatter of pots and the cries of street sellers dissolving into silence. The smoky air clears, leaving only the faint warmth of a hearth glowing softly against the dark. You've walked through kitchens, taverns, soup lines, and alleys, and though the hunger was sharp, you've made it here, safe, full of stories instead of scraps. Let the images blur together now, not as hard truths, but as a tapestry of voices from long ago. The bread crusts, the sugared humbugs, the steaming pots of broth, they become like dream fragments, comforting in their distance. Take a slow breath, as if inhaling the faint sweetness of treacle, and let it linger a moment before releasing it. Another breath, softer now, like steam rising from a pot on a cold night. Your body eases with each exhale, tension falling away the way the city's noise has faded. As you rest, know that you carry the quiet strength of those who survived on little, who found sweetness even in struggle. Their resilience becomes your calm. Their persistence becomes your peace. So let your mind soften into the stillness, carried on the hum of memory, the hush of history. You've traveled through streets long gone, but here and now you are safe, warm, and enough. Allow the last light to dim, the last sounds to hush until there is only calm, only rest, only the gentle promise of sleep.